The tale begins in the frozen heart of the Arctic wilderness, where a lone howl pierces the night and a newborn pup draws his first breath amid a den of shadows and blood. This is Jack London's White Fang, a story that pulls the reader into the raw, unforgiving world of the Yukon during the fevered days of the Klondike Gold Rush, when men surged northward like a tide of ambition, hauling sleds, supplies, and teams of dogs across ice-capped rivers and jagged mountain passes. In that crucible of desperation, survival boiled down to a simple, brutal equation: the strongest, the smartest, the most adaptable would endure, everyone else was swallowed by the relentless weight of ice and hunger. Scholars later coined this the law of the tooth, a metaphor London lifted from his own observations of sled team dynamics, where the sharper Fang, whether literal or symbolic, claims dominance. White Fang's lineage is a tangled knot of wild and tame. His mother, Kitch, is a half-wolf, half-dog who guards her litter with an iron will, while his father, One Eye, shares the same ambiguous heritage. From the moment his eyes open, the pup is thrust into a realm ruled by that very law. The den is cramped, its walls echoing with the metallic scent of blood and the low growl of rivalry. Modern ethology tells us that wolf pups spend their first 8 weeks mastering hierarchy, feeding rituals, and subtle social cues within the pack. London mirrors this with unflinching realism. The mother enforces strict discipline, each morsel must be earned, and any hint of weakness meets instant punishment. The scene feels less romanticized myth than a field notebook transcribed from the work of early naturalists such as Joseph Gould and later zoologist Konrad Lorenz. A sudden rupture shatters the fragile order when Gray Beaver, a stoic Native American trader, captures the young White Fang. For the first time, the animal confronts a completely alien set of signals: human gestures, tone of voice, the quiet hierarchy of a modest cabin. Contemporary research on canine attachment reveals that dogs possess an innate talent for reading human facial expressions and body language, a skill honed over millennia of coevolution. Though still largely wild, White Fang's cautious curiosity and tentative trust echo the secure attachment patterns described by Bowlby and Ainsworth. He learns that a gentle hand may bring food, while a harsh slap heralds pain. This early interaction plants a seed that will later blossom into a complex bond, shaping the rest of his life. The narrative darkens as White Fang falls into the clutches of Beauty Smith, a ruthless showman who views the wolf dog not as a living being but as a profit-driven weapon. Smith forces him into savage dog-fighting rings, pitting him against larger, stronger opponents for the amusement of a saloon crowd. Here London lays bare the exploitative power structure of capitalism in its rawest form. The law of the tooth becomes literal: the animal with the sharper bite wins, while the loser is beaten until he can barely stand. Studies of captive canids confirm that repeated negative reinforcement spikes cortisol levels, induces chronic stress, and breeds learned aggression. White Fang's physiological responses, rapid heartbeat, trembling muscles, a constant hypervigilant stare, match precisely what modern veterinarians observe in dogs subjected to coercive training. London does more than spin a tale. He offers a case study of how relentless environmental pressure can reshape instinctual behavior, turning a natural hunter into a forced combatant. Just when all hope seems lost, fate introduces Weedon Scott, a gold prospector whose compassion challenges the merciless law of the tooth. Scott rescues White Fang from a near-fatal beating, nursing him back to health with patient meals, steady hands, and soothing words. This rescue transcends melodrama, becoming a vivid illustration of trauma recovery. Recent animal trauma research emphasizes the necessity of a secure base, consistent caregiving, and the gradual reintroduction of positive experiences. As White Fang begins to trust Scott, his avoidance behaviors wane, his posture relaxes, and he starts to display affiliative actions, nudging Scott's hand, resting his head on the prospector's knee. These subtle shifts mirror therapeutic principles of dereflection and paradoxical intention, showing how a creature once driven solely by survival can learn to embrace companionship. Through the arc of White Fang's life, from the icy cradle of the Yukon to his final days under the warm sun of a Californian ranch, the novel weaves together scientific observation, philosophical reflection, and historical texture. It asks whether the fierce independence of the wild can ever truly coexist with the gentler demands of civilization, and it leaves the reader pondering the delicate balance between nature's raw edge and humanity's capacity for redemption. This journey leads us into the heart of Viktor Frankl's logotherapy, a philosophy where meaning is not simply found in ease, but discovered through purposeful suffering and the strength of compassionate connection. From there, the narrative shifts toward the quiet intimacy of the domestic sphere. Scott brings White Fang back to his cabin in the frozen reaches of the Yukon, and here, the animal assumes a new, sacred role as the guardian of the home. He protects the homestead with a fierce vigilance, watches over the warmth of the fire, and even shows a newfound restraint, refraining from attacking the other dogs that belong to the family. The wolf dog's primal instinct to dominate has not disappeared, but it has been channeled into a protective loyalty. It is a transformation that mirrors the concept of the will to power, reinterpreted here as a will to protect rather than a will to destroy. In these moments, London subtly critiques the myth of the noble savage. White Fang is neither purely wild nor fully civilized. Instead, he exists in a gray gradient where the boundaries blur, much like the sociological models that view civilization as a continuous spectrum rather than a simple binary. But the peace is interrupted when Scott must return east. He entrusts White Fang to Matt Phil, a fellow prospector. The emotional peak arrives on the steamship bound for San Francisco, where White Fang refuses to abandon his master. In a dramatic surge of devotion, he leaps onto the deck, refusing to step back into the confinement of his crate. This moment underscores the profound theme of loyalty versus possession. While the animal's love for Scott is genuine and raw, the humans surrounding him still view him through the lens of property. To them, he is a wild thing to be owned, tamed, and displayed. This tension between affection and ownership pulses throughout the novel, echoing the broader societal debates about animal rights that would surface a century later with the rise of the animal welfare movement. Upon arriving in California, White Fang enters the world of the Morrison estate in Napa Valley. The family, consisting of Judge Morrison, his wife, and their children, initially react with visceral fear. They describe the wolf dog as a snarling, full-grown wolf. However, over the course of several months, through the application of patient affection, they begin to tame him. The domestic setting becomes a new kind of law, one that reshapes White Fang's identity without erasing the wild heritage etched into his DNA. Modern ethologists refer to this as mutual adaptation, a process where both human and animal adjust their behaviors to coexist. The Morrison household is a perfect example of this. The children learn to respect the animal's space, the parents provide structured routines, and White Fang learns to respond to verbal cues and find joy in companionship. The result is not a simple story of humanity dominating nature, but a negotiated partnership that respects the animal's intrinsic instincts while providing him with safety and a sense of purpose. Let us pause for a moment and consider the broader philosophical framework that ties all these episodes together. London's naturalism is deeply rooted in Darwinian evolution and the Nietzschean will to power. He believed that every living being is subject to a deterministic set of forces, including biology, environment, and economics, which together shape behavior. Yet, he also infused his narratives with a socialist critique, suggesting that the same laws governing the wild also govern human societies, especially under the weight of capitalism. The law of the tooth operates on three distinct levels. First, there is the biological level, where sharp teeth win food. Then, there is the social-economic level, where the tooth of capital dominates labor. Finally, there is the moral-philosophical level, the internal drive to assert power. By showing White Fang navigating each of these levels, from survival in the pack and exploitation under Beauty Smith to redemption under Scott and integration into a middle-class family, London demonstrates that the struggle for dominance and meaning is a universal experience. Another key concept here is the wild civilization boundary. In academic terms, this boundary is not a hard line but a gradient where ontological status, the source of power, and the moral code shift gradually. In the wild, power is immediate, physical, and reciprocal, often a matter of bite for bite. In civilization, power becomes abstract, manifesting as laws, property rights, and wage labor. London blurs these distinctions by giving Buck in The Call of the Wild and White Fang in White Fang the capacity to move fluidly between these two realms. Their journeys illustrate a harsh truth that the law of the tooth remains constant, whether that tooth is a physical fang, a club, or a bank account. Now, let us look at the scientific underpinnings of the domestication process. Modern genetics tells us that dogs diverged from wolves somewhere between 15,000 and 40,000 years ago. This was not a sudden fall, but a mutualistic relationship. Wolves that tolerated human proximity gained access to food scraps, while humans gained early warning systems and hunting partners. Over millennia, selective breeding amplified traits such as reduced aggression, a heightened responsiveness to human gestures, and a natural propensity for forming attachments. White Fang's story, though dramatized for the page, mirrors this co-evolutionary dance. His early feral instincts are tempered by human kindness, allowing dormant neural pathways associated with social bonding to activate. Researchers such as Brian Hare have demonstrated that dogs possess a unique oxytocin response when interacting with humans, a hormone linked directly to trust and affection. When White Fang gazes at Scott, the narrative implicitly captures that biochemical exchange, even if London did not have the science to name it. There's a moment in White Fang, that raw, untamed masterpiece by Jack London, where the line between beast and man blurs into something almost sacred. It's not just a story about a wolf dog, it's a meditation on what it means to be shaped by the world, to fight for survival, and then, against all odds, to learn how to love. And here's the thing, London didn't have the word oxytocin in his vocabulary when he wrote it in 1906. But he understood it. He wrote about the chemistry of trust before science could name it, the way a creature's heart could be rewired not by force, but by something far more powerful, kindness. Now, let's talk about that fascinating tension between wolves and dogs, because White Fang isn't just a wolf, and he isn't just a dog. He's caught in the middle, a living contradiction. Picture a pet dog, tail wagging, eyes bright, pressing against your legs like you're the center of its universe. That's what behaviorists call secure base behavior, a bond forged through generations of companionship, where obedience isn't fear, but a kind of silent conversation. Wolves. They don't work like that. A wolf's loyalty is to the pack, to the hierarchy, to the brutal elegance of survival. They don't seek your approval. They don't need you. But White Fang? He's neither and both. He carries the wolf's wariness in his bones, the coiled spring of a predator always ready to strike. Yet, bit by bit, he learns to lean into a human's touch, to read the shift in a voice, to choose trust over teeth. London isn't just telling a story here, he's dismantling a myth. The idea that tame and wild are opposites, that domestication is some kind of surrender. White Fang laughs at that. For him, it's not about losing his wildness. It's about adding a new layer to it, a relationship that doesn't erase his instincts but expands them. And this is where London's genius shines, the concept of the silver law. It's not a term he coined, but scholars use it to describe how the brutal law of the tooth, the rule of claws and fangs, can be refined. Not erased. Not weakened. But redirected. Beauty Smith, that grotesque caricature of a man, takes the silver law and twists it into something monstrous. He doesn't tame White Fang, he breaks him, sharpening his aggression into a weapon for profit, turning a living creature into a bloodsport commodity. There's no love in it, no respect, just the cold calculus of exploitation. Then there's Weedon Scott. He doesn't crush White Fang's spirit, he answers it. He takes that same raw, feral strength and gives it a purpose beyond survival. Under Scott's care, White Fang's teeth aren't dulled, they're repurposed. No longer tools of violence, they become the guardrails of protection, the silent promise of a bond. And later, with the Morrison family, we see the silver law evolve even further. White Fang learns to coexist, to share space with other animals, to temper his instincts with patience. It's not just training. It's culture, proof that even the harshest laws can bend towards something gentler, if the hands guiding them are wise enough. Now, let's step back for a moment and bring in a name you might not expect, Viktor Frankl. Decades after White Fang was published, Frankl would write Man's Search for Meaning, arguing that our purpose isn't invented, it's discovered through work, through love, and yes, through suffering. Sound familiar? White Fang's life is a textbook example. His suffering under Beauty Smith isn't just pain, it's a crucible, forcing him to confront the limits of his own existence. His love for Scott isn't just affection, it's a revelation, a reason to exist beyond the next meal or the next fight. And his work, guarding the cabin, later the Morrison estate, isn't just duty, it's contribution, a role that gives his strength meaning. Even after Scott's death, when grief threatens to swallow him whole, White Fang doesn't collapse. He adapts. He finds a new purpose in protecting what his master loved. London, whether he knew it or not, was writing existential philosophy long before Frankl put a name to it. But you can't talk about White Fang without feeling the frost of the Yukon in your lungs. This isn't just a story, it's a snapshot of a moment in history when the world was still raw and untamed. The Klondike Gold Rush wasn't just a hunt for wealth, it was a collision of human ambition and nature's indifference. The Arctic frontier was a place where a wrong step could mean frostbite, where a weak sled dog could mean death. In that world, strength wasn't just valued, it was currency. And sled dogs? They were the engines of survival, their worth measured in endurance, in the ability to pull a load through blizzards that would kill a man in hours. London knew this world firsthand. He'd lived it, starved in it, nearly died in it. And he saw the hypocrisy beneath the myth of progress. The gold rush was sold as a triumph of human grit, but the reality was uglier, a free-for-all where the strong exploited the weak, where animals were worked to death, where the land itself was stripped and discarded. The dog-fighting rings in White Fang aren't just plot devices, they're a mirror. London is showing us a society that preaches civilization while running on brutality, that talks about survival of the fittest, while ignoring the cost of that survival. Social Darwinism was the intellectual flavor of the day, and London, who flirted with its ideas, also saw its rot. The Yukon didn't care about your philosophy. It only cared if you could endure. And endurance is at the heart of White Fang's most human trait, his loyalty. Too often, we dismiss animal devotion as instinct, as some Pavlovian trick of rewards and punishments. But ethologists, scientists who study animal behavior, will tell you there's a world of difference between dominance-based submission and true affiliative bonding. White Fang's loyalty to Scott isn't born from fear. It's built, moment by moment, through shared warmth, through the rhythm of a hand on his fur, through the quiet understanding that this human won't betray him. When Scott dies, White Fang doesn't just mourn, he unravels. He refuses food. He paces the cabin like a ghost. And then, in a moment that will gut you if you've ever loved an animal, he howls into the night, a sound that isn't just noise, but grief given voice. Wolves do this. Real wolves, in the wild, howl for their dead. London wasn't anthropomorphizing. He was observing. Then there's the question of where White Fang comes from, not just his personal history, but his ancestry. London traces his lineage back to the wild, to a she-wolf who mated with a domesticated dog, creating a bloodline that's both and neither. It's evolution in action, a living debate between nature and nurture. Modern science would call this epigenetics, the idea that trauma or triumph in one generation can echo in the genes of the next. White Fang's ability to shift between feral savagery and gentle companionship isn't a flaw in his character, it's his superpower. He's adaptable because his ancestors had to be. His DNA isn't a prison, it's a toolkit, and his environment decides which tools he uses. So why does White Fang still claw at our hearts over a century later? Maybe because we're living in an age where the line between wild and civilized feels thinner than ever. Climate change is redrawing the maps of habitats. Factories and forests are locked in a war for space. And every day, we're forced to ask, what do we owe the creatures we share this planet with? Are they resources? Property? Or are they something more, beings with their own stories, their own suffering, their own capacity for love. London doesn't give easy answers. He shows us a world where the law of the tooth is real, where survival is earned in blood and snow. But he also shows us that law isn't the only one. There's another force just as powerful, the law of the heart. White Fang starts as a creature of the wild, but he doesn't end there. He becomes something new, not less than he was, but more. And in that transformation, London leaves us with a challenge: civilization isn't about conquering the wild. It's about learning to live with it. With respect. With compassion. With the humility to recognize that sometimes, the thing we call savagery is just another kind of wisdom. And that's the lesson White Fang carries in his scars. The boundaries we draw, between animal and human, between wild and tame, aren't walls. They're thresholds. And crossing them doesn't require losing who you are. It just requires a move back and forth, learning from each realm. Second, that power structures, whether natural, economic, or domestic, shape behavior, but they are not immutable, they can be reshaped through humane intervention. Third, that loyalty and affection are not signs of weakness but evidence of deep relational capacity, even in the fiercest of predators. And fourth, that meaning can be forged in the crucible of suffering, just as Frankl taught, and just as White Fang discovers through his trials. Imagine standing on the banks of the Yukon River, where the ice glows beneath a sky painted with ribbons of emerald and violet light. The air is sharp, brittle with cold, and somewhere in the distance, a howl cuts through the silence, not quite wolf, not quite dog, but something caught between. It's a sound that carries memory, pain, and finally, belonging. Now picture a steamship slicing through the dark waters of the Pacific, its deck lit by lanterns swaying in the salt wind. There, perched like a sentinel at the bow, stands a massive creature, fur thick against the chill, eyes locked on a horizon that no longer promises only survival, but safety, companionship, peace. Feel the warmth of a California morning spilling over a sun-baked ranch, golden light pooling on the porch where a once feral animal lies curled beside a child's bare feet, tail thumping softly in the dust. These images aren't just scenes, they're echoes of Jack London's enduring message: life is a constant negotiation between the forces that claim us, protect us, exploit us, and cherish us. The law of the tooth may dictate the rules of the game, the brutal calculus of strength and hunger, but the heart, whether human or animal, writes the story. The story does not end when the camera fades out on that sunlit ranch. In truth, it only begins. Because White Fang isn't just a novel, it's a portal opening onto a vast tapestry of ecological truths, cultural memories, and scientific revelations that still ripple through our world today. From forgotten expeditions to the secrets buried in DNA, from indigenous wisdom to the quiet resilience of hybrid beings, the legacy of White Fang stretches far beyond the page. In 1903, while Jack London was shaping the final chapters of his novel, a small government expedition set out across the frozen north under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Mackenzie of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Most readers link White Fang to the gold rush chaos of Dawson or the bustling docks of San Francisco, but this quiet survey mission, launched from Fort McPherson, offers a haunting mirror to the world London imagined. Mackenzie's team traveled with a team of sled dogs, two of whom were direct descendants of the very wolves that prowled the same valleys as White Fang's ancestors, animals born of ice and instinct, shaped by centuries of survival. One night, near the Porcupine River, the world turned white. A sudden blizzard swallowed the landscape, disorienting men and dogs alike. The lead dog, Casket, a hulking gray beast with eyes like chips of obsidian, refused to move. He stood rigid, hackles raised, snarling into the wind as if confronting a rival pack emerging from the storm itself. The men could have beaten him forward. They could have shouted, pulled, forced obedience. But instead, they stopped. They built a shelter from snow and spruce boughs, shared their rations, pressed close for warmth. They waited. And by morning, something had shifted. Casket no longer growled at the wind. He nosed the harness, ready to pull. The journey resumed. In his journal, Mackenzie wrote, "The dog's spirit mirrors that of the land, wild yet capable of trust when met with steady kindness." That line could have been lifted straight from London's pen. It captures the soul of White Fang, that taming is not breaking, that trust is earned, not taken, and that even the wildest heart can learn to walk beside a human without losing its soul. More than a century later, science has begun to catch up with what stories have always known. In 2017, a team of geneticists published a groundbreaking study comparing the mitochondrial DNA of Arctic wolves, historic sled dogs, and modern feral canids captured near the Yukon border. What they found shattered old assumptions. The boundary between wolf and dog, long thought to be clear and fixed, was anything but. Gene flow between wild and domesticated populations was significant, especially in the early 1800s, suggesting that animals like White Fang, caught between two worlds, were not fictional anomalies, but biological realities. One case stood out. In 2012, a male wolf dog was found wandering near Skagway, thin but alert, moving with the silent precision of a predator yet showing no fear of humans. Genetic testing revealed that 38% of his genome traced back to St. Lawrence Island Inuit sled dogs, dogs bred for endurance, loyalty, and cooperation. The rest matched the haplotypes of inland gray wolves, the kind that stalk the high valleys and vanish at the first scent of man. This animal wasn't just a mix, he was a living paradox. He hunted with the focus of a wolf, tracking hare and caribou with uncanny skill, yet he allowed researchers to approach, to feed him, even to touch him. He didn't submit. He tolerated. He observed. He decided. Here was White Fang made flesh, a creature of dual inheritance, shaped by both blood and bond, embodying the very tension London explored, that we are not defined solely by our origins, but by the choices we make, and the connections we allow. These findings do more than confirm a novelist's intuition. They challenge a deep-seated myth, that nature and culture are opposites, that wildness and domestication are mutually exclusive. When we watch White Fang endure beatings, survive battles, and finally choose love over violence, we're not just witnessing fiction. We're seeing a process etched into real genomes, played out across generations of canids who moved between worlds, who carried the genes of hunters and helpers in the same body. The transformation isn't magic. It's biology, history, and relationship intertwined. And then there is knowledge older than journals, older than DNA sequencing, the wisdom of those who lived alongside these animals long before settlers arrived. London's narrative largely frames canine companionship through a colonial lens, dogs as tools, as property, as subjects to be broken or saved. But among the Tlingit people of the Pacific Northwest, the relationship was never so one-sided. Dogs were not merely workers, they were kin. Oral histories speak of hunting partners who guided lost travelers home, of sentinels who warned villages of approaching danger, of animals buried with ceremony, their spirits honored in song. To the Tlingit, a dog's loyalty was not submission, it was reciprocity. They gave protection, they received care. They ran with humans, not behind them, but beside them. This perspective reframes everything. White Fang's journey isn't just about survival or taming. It's about finding balance, between independence and connection, between instinct and choice, between the call of the wild and the warmth of the fire. And that balance isn't a destination. It's a rhythm. A dance. One step into the forest, one step toward the cabin. One breath of pine, one breath of wood smoke. To live in both worlds is not to belong to neither, it is to carry both within you. When we look back at the history of the American frontier, it is easy to see the bond between people and animals through the narrow eyes of European settlers who arrived with their rifles and ledgers. But long before the frantic rush for gold echoed through those valleys, the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest held a far deeper and more intricate understanding of canine behavior. Anthropologist Franz Boas captured fragments of this ancient wisdom in the early 1900s, recording oral histories that paint a completely different picture. Among the Tlingit people, raising wolf dogs was never just about securing food or tracking game. These animals were raised as spiritual mediators, living bridges between the human world and the wild. Stories passed down through generations tell of a sacred trial known as the rite of the first hunt. When a young wolf dog successfully completed this demanding test, it did not simply earn its keep. It earned a permanent place in the clan totemic lineage, becoming a living symbol of the delicate balance between raw ferocity and unwavering loyalty. This profound connection is not locked away in dusty archives. In a 2021 ethnographic study, a Tlingit elder named Kukisik shared a quiet ritual that continues to breathe life into these old traditions today. Picture a young boy standing near the water edge, holding a freshly caught fish. He offers it to his companion, an animal that carries the bloodline of both wolf and dog. As he places the offering down, he whispers a soft prayer of gratitude, thanking the creature for its guidance and protection. What happens next matters deeply. If the animal steps forward and accepts the gift, it is read as a good sign, promising abundance for the coming season. If it turns away, the elders take note, preparing for leaner times ahead. Practices like this reveal something crucial about survival in the wild. The so-called law of the tooth is often painted as a brutal and unforgiving rule of nature. Yet here, it transforms into a reciprocal covenant. Respect and provision are carefully exchanged for safety and companionship. By stepping into this older worldview, we begin to see the story of White Fang in a much richer light. His journey stops being just a simple tale of breaking a wild beast. Instead, it becomes part of a vast mosaic of cultural attitudes toward the wilderness, showing us how deeply intertwined human and canine lives have been for thousands of years. The forces that shaped the world around White Fang were never static. They shifted and cracked just like the ice floes drifting down the Yukon River. During the peak of the fur trade, the economy ran on pelts rather than precious metals. A single well-preserved coat could fetch prices higher than a miner's entire seasonal haul, which meant trappers quickly learned to prioritize capturing wolves and foxes over digging for mineral wealth. But as the 20th century rolled in, the winds changed direction once again. A growing middle class along the East Coast and in California began looking at exotic canines through an entirely different lens. These animals were no longer seen as mere commodities or working tools. They became walking status symbols, living trophies for wealthy parlors. You can see this shift clearly in a 1924 advertisement that ran in the Saturday Evening Post. It featured a sleek Siberian wolf dog listed for $250, which was a staggering fortune back then. The copywriters promised buyers they could own the untamed spirit of the frozen north, safely packaged for their drawing rooms. That kind of clever marketing perfectly mirrors the strange contradiction found throughout Jack London writing. He celebrated both the fierce independence of the wild and the comforting order of civilization, turning the animal into a product that satisfied a deep craving for authenticity while neatly removing all the actual danger. Jump ahead to our current century, and you will find that same desire has exploded into a massive global enterprise. The modern pet industry now pulls in billions of dollars every single year. Breeders actively engineer designer lines like the Alaskan Klee Kai and the Czechoslovakian wolf dog specifically to capture that fading echo of the wilderness. People want the look and the legend, but they rarely stop to consider the heavy costs hidden behind the pedigree papers. These commercial ventures frequently ignore the very ethical questions that London wove into his fiction. We have to ask ourselves about the welfare of creatures bred purely for aesthetic appeal. We have to think about the slow erosion of genetic diversity when breeding focuses on appearance over health. And perhaps most importantly, we must confront the psychological strain placed on an animal born with sharp predatory instincts when it is forced to live inside a quiet suburban home. The tension between what we want them to be and what they actually are remains unresolved. To truly understand why White Fang still resonates so powerfully, it helps to place him alongside other great animal stories from the same era. Take Jack London's own famous novel, The Call of the Wild. That book tells almost the exact opposite tale. It follows a pampered house dog named Buck who slowly sheds his civilized training and sinks back into primal savagery. Then look at Mikhail Bulgakov's Heart of a Dog, published in 1925. That story uses a street mutt surgically transformed into a man as a sharp satire of Soviet attempts to force social engineering upon unwilling citizens. Both of these books play with the idea of identity stretching and snapping under outside pressure. Yet White Fang sits right in the middle of that spectrum. He never fully belongs to the forest, nor does he ever completely surrender to the hearth. He constantly drifts between two opposing worlds, carrying pieces of both. Another interesting parallel emerges when we look at Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea. In that classic, the giant marlin stands as a noble opponent whose eventual defeat becomes a quiet meditation on human dignity and inevitable loss. In London narrative, the protagonist plays a dual role. He is both the threat and the protector, the enemy and the friend. This constant push and pull creates a complex dialectic that refuses to fit into neat little boxes. It quietly asks us to reconsider where true agency comes from. Does it live entirely inside the individual, or does it only emerge through the messy and beautiful web of relationships between different species? These literary questions bleed directly into the real-world challenges we face today. Over the last few decades, ecologists have championed a practice known as rewilding, hoping to restore damaged environments back to their original and untouched states. Projects like the famous wolf reintroduction program in Yellowstone National Park bring the core themes of White Fang into sharp focus. They prove that bringing apex predators back to the land can completely reshape physical landscapes, naturally control prey populations, and even alter how humans interact with nature. But reality rarely matches the tidy endings of fiction. While the fictional hero eventually finds peace and purpose within human society, real rewilded wolves often step straight into conflict. Ranchers watching their livelihoods worry constantly about livestock losses, creating a tense standoff between conservation goals and agricultural survival. A 2020 case study from the Canadian boreal forest captures this friction perfectly. After a small pack of wolves wandered into an area dotted with mixed-use family farms, the situation threatened to boil over. Instead of resorting to immediate culling, local leaders organized a series of community workshops. These meetings brought wildlife biologists and struggling farmers together around the same table. Through patient conversation, they developed practical solutions like non-lethal deterrent systems and fair compensatory insurance programs. By choosing dialogue over destruction, the community proved that coexistence is possible, echoing the very same hard-won lessons of trust and mutual respect that define the enduring legacy of the wild. They managed to reduce predation incidents by 70% while preserving the wolves' natural hunting patterns. This collaborative model reflects the nuanced ethic London hinted at, coexistence achieved through mutual respect rather than domination. Not through fear, not through force, but through quiet understanding, the kind that grows when humans stop seeing animals as problems to solve and start seeing them as neighbors with their own rhythms, their own needs, their own quiet dignity. Recent advances in comparative psychology have begun to map the contours of attachment in non-human mammals. At the University of Cambridge, researchers watched as wolf dogs, raised in controlled environments, formed bonds that mirrored the same insecure, anxious, and secure attachments first observed in human infants. Those with consistent, gentle caregivers moved through the world with relaxed shoulders, curious noses, and eyes that scanned not for threats, but for possibilities. Their cortisol levels dipped. They explored. They played. They trusted. But the ones raised with erratic hands, sometimes fed, sometimes struck, carried tension in their spines. Their ears never fully lowered. Their tails never quite wagged. They were always half ready to flee. And when we apply this to White Fang, the story shifts. His early life with beauty, with its sudden blows and rare scraps of kindness, didn't just teach him to survive, it taught him to expect betrayal. Every human hand became a potential fist. Every voice, a prelude to pain. But then came Weedon Scott. Not with grand gestures, but with patience. With stillness. With meals offered without demand, with silence that didn't feel like abandonment. That bond didn't erase White Fang's past, it rewrote his future. It gave him a safe harbor from which he could finally, tentatively, believe he belonged somewhere. Love, in that sense, wasn't soft. It was revolutionary. It didn't just calm a wild creature, it reconfigured his entire understanding of the world. One of the most daring things about White Fang is how it lets us feel the world through the animal's senses without turning him into a human in fur. London doesn't give White Fang thoughts in polished English prose. He doesn't make him quote Shakespeare or ponder morality. Instead, he lets us feel the cold bite of frost on his nose, the metallic tang of blood in his mouth after a kill, the way the wind carries the scent of smoke from distant fires, the vibration of footsteps through snow before the figure even comes into view. This isn't anthropomorphism, it's empathy made sensory. Susan Sontag once wrote that giving voice to the non-human doesn't make them like us, it makes us realize how little we've ever truly listened. And in this book, we are forced to listen. Every time a man raises a stick, White Fang doesn't just see a weapon, he feels the memory of every blow that came before. Every time a child reaches out, he doesn't just see a hand, he feels the ghost of a fist. The novel doesn't ask us to pity him. It asks us to feel what it's like to be him. And in that feeling, the line between predator and pet, wild and tame, becomes less a boundary and more a fragile, trembling bridge. As technology evolves, so does our ability to step into White Fang's world, not just as readers, but as participants. New virtual reality experiences, born from collaborations between literary scholars and game designers, now let you walk the Yukon winter as a wolf dog. You feel the crunch of ice under your paws. You smell the faint musk of a caribou in the distance. Your breath hangs in the air like smoke. You must decide, do you approach the flickering lights of the human camp, where food might wait but danger also lingers? Or do you retreat into the silence of the forest, where hunger is certain but freedom is yours? Early users report something unexpected: after just 20 minutes in this digital wilderness, they feel differently about wolves. Not as monsters to fear, not as trophies to hunt, but as beings who choose, who suffer, who long for safety just as we do. This isn't just entertainment. It's a new kind of education, one that doesn't lecture, but immerses. It doesn't tell you to care. It makes you feel why you already do. When we step back from all the science, the psychology, the technology, the history, one thread remains, stronger than all the rest. Identity isn't fixed. It's not stamped into you at birth like a brand. It's shaped, again and again, by the land beneath your paws, the hands that touch you, the choices you're allowed to make. White Fang's journey, from the frozen riverbanks of the Klondike, where survival meant biting first and asking later, to the sun-warmed pastures of California, where a hand offered food without a whip, mirrors every life caught between worlds. We all carry the law of the tooth inside us, the instinct to guard, to compete, to survive at all costs. But we also carry the law of the heart, the quiet pull toward connection, toward tenderness, toward something bigger than ourselves. Whether you're a policymaker writing laws for wolves, a parent holding a trembling rescue pup, or someone sitting alone in a quiet room, turning the last page of this book, you're not just reading a story. You're living it. So as you close this, ask yourself, what wild parts of you have been silenced? What parts of you still flinch at kindness, still expect pain? And what might happen if you, like White Fang, were given the chance to believe, really believe, that you could belong? Imagine walking a trail where the scent of pine mingles with distant traffic, and a lone husky pauses, ears perked, as if hearing the same ancient rhythm that once guided White Fang through snow and silence. In that moment, you don't just see an animal. You see a mirror. And in that mirror, the possibility of coexistence flickers, not as a dream, but as a choice, one step, one breath, one quiet act of respect at a time. Who listen?